The waiting room became an arena, a routine flight became a public execution, and no one could have anticipated the storm Melania's arrival would cause. The final boarding call echoed through the crowded terminal at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. Barron Trump, hunched in a chair that seemed too cramped for his statuesque figure, sat at the boarding gate. He was staring at his phone screen, as if trying to disappear into the crowd of rushing passengers. In his 17 years, he was already used to an unconventional life, and the ability to remain inconspicuous had become his shield. But today, his art faces a stern test. An airline employee with sharp facial features and unconcealed impatience approached the priority boarding area. His gaze, like a knife, stabbed into Barron's. Something in his aloofness, in his reluctance to attract attention, titillated the man. The agent's voice, cutting through the noise, sounded like a sentence. "Excuse me, young man." The tone was wary, surprised, but restrained. "Yes, I'm sure I have a first-class ticket," Barron replied, his voice even, polite. His upbringing, like an impregnable fortress, protected him. The agent eyed him carefully, slipping on a plain hoodie, sneakers, catching the screen of his phone. "May I see your ticket?" Barron hesitated. It wasn't the first time he had been snatched out of a crowd for no apparent reason, but something in this man's tone made him wary. He held out his boarding pass. The name Barron Trump popped up on the screen. The agent read aloud, paused, and his expression changed. But instead of backing away, he frowned and stiffened. "Wait here." The passengers around them froze. Whispers drifted through the hall. Faces turned red, but Barron, holding back his irritation, maintained a mask of calm. A few minutes later, the agent returned, leading the supervisor behind him. "There seems to be a problem with your ticket," the agent coined. "You need to step aside while we sort this out." Barron frowned. "What problem? I bought this ticket weeks ago." The supervisor stepped into the conversation. "We're solving it, sir. Please step away from the gate." Barron reluctantly stepped back, feeling the stares fixed on him as the phones recorded his every move. The whispers were increasing. Disappointment was growing, but he held on, not wanting to cause a scandal. But the situation wasn't going to subside. It was only gaining momentum. Barron leaned against a pillar, watching the other passengers calmly boarding. The airport staff, like predators, kept their eyes on him. The crowd watched with undisguised curiosity. The tension was building with every passing second. He shifted from foot to foot, not understanding the reason for the delay. A last name? Something else? He wasn't jumping to conclusions, but the situation was beginning to seem deliberately cruel. After a few agonizing minutes, the supervisor returned. His expression was stern. "We need another document to verify your identity." Barron frowned. "My passport is in my carry-on. You didn't even check it." The supervisor stammered, puzzled by the logical answer, but instead of backing down, became even more insistent. "Sir, it's not just a matter of ID. There are procedures we have to follow." "What procedures?" Barron asked, his tone on the verge of bewilderment and fury. "I've flown through this airport dozens of times, and there have been no problems." The agent who had approached him first interjected, "There have been some unusual situations recently. No one is singling you out." But his eyes read a lie. Passengers standing nearby began to whisper. A woman in her 40s, cradling her child, couldn't stand it. "What's the problem? He's just a guy with a ticket. Let him get on the flight." The supervisor ignored her, focusing all his attention on Barron. "You need to wait here while we do some additional screening. If you do not comply..." Barron's patience began to break like a taut string. "What are you going to do? I haven't done anything wrong." As if on cue, 2 airport security officers appeared. Barron's chest clenched, not from fear, but from disbelief at how quickly the situation was unfolding. The officers stood on either side of him, drawing even more attention. The phones clicked again, capturing every moment of this senseless drama. "Sir, please follow us," one of the officers said in a calm but firm tone. The Baron exhaled, clenched his jaws, and picked up his carry-on. "Okay." He followed them into a small, sterile room near the exit. Whispers and camera flashes followed him like a dark cloud. Inside, the officers asked him to sit at a table. The air became cold and heavy. One of the officers began leafing through his passport. "Just following protocol, son," he muttered, but the word protocol sounded like an excuse for something more sinister. The more they dug into his data, the more Barron felt the weight of unspoken bias. What he didn't know was that a storm of retribution was already rushing toward him. A black SUV was making its way through the streets of Dallas. Melania Trump, subdued, held her cell phone in her hands. She had planned a short trip to surprise her son after his flight, but a sudden flurry of text messages and social media notifications changed her expression from serene to worried. One message caught her eye. "Something is happening to Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." She quickly opened the short clip showing Barron, surrounded by security, walking away from the gate. She watched it twice, her eyebrows furrowed, growing harder with each viewing. "Driver, hurry up," she said, her voice as cold as ice but imbued with steel. Meanwhile, at the airport, Barron sat in a small room, staring into nothing. The officers had gone out to check his information, leaving him alone in silence. He didn't know who to call, what to do. His hands rested on the desk, fingers tapping lightly, as if beating out a rhythm of hopelessness. Suddenly, the door opened and a supervisor walked in. "We're still working to resolve the situation," he said, avoiding eye contact. "How much longer?" Barron asked, his tone becoming abrupt. "You've had my information for an hour." The supervisor faltered and spoke again about some sort of procedure before backing off. Barron sighed, running a hand through his hair. It was no longer just a matter of a ticket or ID. It had become something deeply personal. Outside the terminal, Melania's black SUV pulled up to the sidewalk. She got out, her posture confident despite her simple clothes. All eyes turned to her as she walked through the airport. Her heels clacked tinkling on the polished floor. She didn't need to announce her presence. People just knew. "Excuse me," she addressed the airline employee. "Where's my son?" The employee blinked, stunned by the directness of her question. "Ma'am, I'll check right now." Melania didn't wait for an answer. She walked forward, her gaze sliding down the hall, looking for Barron. When she spotted the room where he was being held, she quickened her step. She reached the door the moment the two officers returned to the room. They froze when they saw her. There was confusion on their faces. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but full of heavy menace demanding an answer. "Mrs. Trump," began one of the officers, stammering. "This is just standard protocol." "Protocol?" she interrupted, her gaze icy. "You're holding my son in this tiny room. Is that protocol?" The supervisor appeared behind her. His face went pale. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding. We were trying to verify his ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Her voice remained calm, but her tone grew harsher. "Do you treat all passengers like that? Or just the ones you decide to single out?" A dead silence hung in the room. The tension became so thick that time seemed to stop. Melania was going to demand answers they couldn't give. Her gaze didn't waver as she stood in the doorway. Her presence was commanding. Barron looked at his mother, and relief flooded him. Though he tried to hide it, he straightened in his chair, his shoulders no longer slumped. "Mrs. Trump," the supervisor began, stammering. Drops of sweat protruded from his forehead. "Please understand. We were just trying to make sure everything was okay." "It's not okay," she interrupted, her voice as sharp as the silence in the room. "You had his ticket, his passport, his name. What else do you need? A boarding invitation written in gold letters?" The supervisor flinched, but tried to excuse himself. "We flagged his name in the system. It required additional checks." Melania tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Marked because he's my son, or because someone decided he shouldn't fly first class today?" The officers exchanged awkward glances. No one wanted to be the first to answer. "Standard procedure, madam. We didn't know of his relationship to you until just now," one of them muttered. Melania narrowed her eyes. "His last name?" The supervisor opened his mouth to object, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Save your excuses. I want to talk to whoever is responsible for this." He hesitated, but finally nodded and went outside to make a call. Melania turned to Barron. Her expression softened as she approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Barron nodded, his voice steady but with a tinge of disappointment. "Yes, I'm fine. They're just wasting my time." Melania squeezed his shoulder gently before turning to the officers again. "Let me get something straight," she said, her voice steady and confident. "You humiliated my son in front of dozens of people. This isn't about protocol or procedures. This is about respect, or lack thereof." One of the officers shifted perceptibly. "Mrs. Trump, we're going to fix this. We'll make sure he gets on the next flight." "You think this is all about boarding the flight?" she interrupted, her voice rising slightly for the first time in a while. "That's not what this is about. I don't want apologies whispered behind closed doors. I want them to be voiced where it started, outside." The supervisor returned, now accompanied by a more senior airport official. He extended a hand, which Melania deliberately ignored. "I realize there has been a misunderstanding," he began. "I assure you, we will review the incident and take appropriate action." "Appropriate measures?" Melania raised an eyebrow. "That means a full investigation into the actions of those who escalated the situation for no reason, and a review of the recording that will show how it all began." The officer turned pale. "We can certainly retrieve the tapes, ma'am." "Do it," she retorted firmly, "and do it right now." The room shrank as everyone waited for the officer with the laptop to act. Surveillance footage showed Barron sitting calmly at the gate before the agent approached him. It captured everything from the unnecessary questions to the rising tension that led to Barron being led away. Melania watched the video silently, her face impenetrable. When it ended, she turned to the supervisor. "You owe my son a public apology." "Of course," the man stammered. "We'll make it right." But Melania wasn't about to be appeased. It wasn't just about apologizing. It was about getting the word out that no one should tolerate this attitude, regardless of their name or status. The warden, now visibly shaken, led them back toward the exit. Melania walked beside him, her stride firm and determined. Barron followed behind them. The tension in the terminal was almost palpable. The witnesses to the previous commotion still remained in place. Their curiosity had been piqued by the return of the teenager and his mother. As they approached the exit, the warden stepped forward. He coughed and addressed the crowd. His voice shook slightly, but he continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take a moment to apologize for the situation that occurred earlier today. A misunderstanding involving one of our passengers, Mr. Barron Trump, led to actions that were unnecessary and inappropriate." The crowd murmured. A few passengers exchanged surprised looks. Others nodded in agreement. The warden glanced at Melania, whose firm gaze nudged him. "I want to make it clear," he said, his voice growing more confident, "that this young man did nothing wrong. The incident was entirely the result of our mistake, and we deeply regret the inconvenience and discomfort caused." Barron stood quietly, hands in his pockets. His expression was neutral, but inside he felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever felt humiliated in public. Melania stepped forward. Her presence caught the attention of every person in the room. "Thank you for your words," she began, her tone poised but determined. "But words aren't everything. This isn't just about my son. It's about the principle of treating everyone with respect and dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from." The room froze. Her words pierced the air like a blade. "My son may attract attention, but he's also a human being, a young man who deserves to be treated fairly, just like every passenger in this airport. Let this be a reminder to us all. Stop and think before you act. Remember that respect is not based on status, but on the humanity we all possess." The crowd exploded with applause. Some passengers even stood up in solidarity. The warden lowered his head. His face flushed red with shame. For a moment, there was a new feeling in the airport, not condemnation or division, but unity. When the applause died down, the woman with the baby approached Barron and Melania. "I just wanted to say that I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said quietly. "It was wrong." Her eyes were full of gratitude. "Thank you, that means a lot," Melania replied. Barron nodded, grateful but still digesting the storm of events. But this moment of clarity wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a conversation about respect, equality, and responsibility that spread far beyond these walls. When things calmed down, the airline staff, now surprisingly cautious, made every effort to ensure their comfort, offering drinks and priority boarding. But Melania politely declined. For her, it wasn't about compensation. It was about principle. Barron sat across from her, hands folded in his lap. "Yeah," he said, breaking the silence. Melania looked up from the phone. The expression on her face softened. "You behaved honorably," she replied. "It's not easy to stay calm at times like this." Barron shrugged. "I've encountered it before, but not so publicly." Melania leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "Here's the problem," she said. "No one should have to get used to being treated like this. Whether it's you, me, or someone no one knows, respect shouldn't be based on last name or appearance." Barron nodded. His mother's words penetrated his very soul. "Do you think they'll really change anything after this?" She hesitated. "Maybe not today, but moments like this accumulate. People notice. And sometimes it only takes one person standing up and saying, 'You have to think before you act,' to make others think." While they waited, Melania pulled out her phone and started typing. A few minutes later, the tweet appeared on her page. "Today my son experienced something no one should have to experience. Being judged before you are understood. Let this be a reminder. Treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their name or past. Respect is a universal right. Let's do better." The post quickly gained popularity, sparking an online discussion about bias, accountability, and respect in public spaces. Barron scrolled through the comments. Some criticized, but most reflected the idea that fairness and dignity should be untouchable. When it was finally time to board the plane, Barron and Melania walked to the gate together. The staff, now considerably more courteous, ushered them through without a problem. Once they were settled in their seats, Melania glanced at her son, who already had his headphones on and was looking out the window. She smiled faintly, thinking of the larger context. This wasn't just about Barron. It was about every person who had ever felt small, rejected. And moments like this are opportunities to learn, to change, to remind the world that respect is not a privilege, but a right. As the plane picked up speed on the runway, Melania closed her eyes. Her thoughts returned to the day's events. It hadn't been an easy experience, but she hoped it would leave a mark not only on the memories of those who had lived it. After all, sometimes the most powerful lessons come in moments of despair. And how we respond can inspire others to overcome prejudice and embrace kindness. If this story resonated with you, for those who may need a reminder of the importance of respect and fairness, let's change together. One step at a time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss other stories that inspire reflection and change.